Purpose Highway is a space for discussions that drive connections toward people's highest purpose to build a better self and a better world. Join me for season 1, where I start to uncover stories of entrepreneurs and thinkers that are making an impact. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and enjoy today's episode. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Purpose Highway podcast. And we have as our very special guest today, the co-founder and CEO of the Spectrum Design Foundation, the one and only Patrick Bardsley. Patrick, we're going to talk about exactly what Spectrum is and what makes it so special in a minute. But one of the things that I want to dive right into is something that impacted me from the very first day that we met, which at this point has been, well over a year ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, actually. And that is the fact that you are so driven by purpose, and that purpose has manifested itself in a truly unique way. As we prepared for this podcast, we talked about your feeling that you really manifested in your business life, that every single human being matters. Talk to me a little bit about how you came to that and what that means for you as an entrepreneur.
Oh yeah, thanks so much, Scott. Thanks for having me, and credit to you. This is such a great podcast, and I'm really happy to be here. Every human being matters. It started for me as an 18-year-old, a vain 18-year-old at a summer camp and meeting families. I got placed at a special needs camp and with no experience, and talking to those families and hearing their stories and learning about their fears of what was next. The summer camp ends, the school bus stops coming when the high school, when they graduate high school, and these are people with autism and special needs whose parents were so fearful of death, who were fearful of their own. I've never heard a parent saying, "I hope I outlive my child," because they're so fearful of what's going to happen when their children get old and aren't independent. So in terms of every human being matters, for me, it was these people matter. And our vision as an organization and my vision was always that a world could see only ability and not disability, And so for me, that became a kind of lifelong vocation to try and ease those pains for those parents and those fears, and also show the world what every human being can do when given a fair opportunity.
It's interesting, though, because lots of folks have worked in summer camps or other institutional settings that are working with folks with special needs, particularly when they're younger. And that is a job for them. And they are interested in it, and they're glad that they did that work. But then they move on and their life moves in whatever direction they want it to. What made this stick with you?
Good question. I think for me, it was always, I found something that was bigger than myself. And for me, that's one of the very simple keys to happiness in life, and finding purpose and saying, I'm putting this human being as a vain kind of self-absorbed 18-year-old. Suddenly I'm in charge of this 13-year-old who's nonverbal and profoundly affected by autism and seizures. And I'm putting everything in front of him. He eats before me, he gets dressed before me, he showers before me. And suddenly I was like, it made me so happy. And I didn't need things. We didn't even have cell service. It was upstate New York, and it was 2006, the internet was flaky. And so it just, I was so happy I couldn't wait to get back. And I got off the plane back in London, and I spoke to my dad, and he gave me that old adage that, when you love your work, you'll never, you love your job, you'll never work another day in your life. And it changed the whole direction of my life. And I said to myself, I was about to do a degree in, funny enough, I was about to do a degree in international business. I was raised around business, and I switched to sociology. I wanted to do something more involved with learning about people and history. And I did end up kind of on a track to moving over to the States 3 years later after my degree, and going to graduate school and actually living with the boy and his family that I worked with at that summer camp those years prior. So everything kind of happened that way.
Now, talk to us a little bit about Spectrum Design. What does it do exactly, and how does that tie into your purpose exactly?
So that same family and another parent, parents who have that fear, and their children were turning 18, and Nicholas and is the boy I work with. I moved over in January 2010, and I'm going to grad school, and 6 months in, I'm living in their house kind of as a butler, and his father passed away suddenly. He was actually on an airplane, he passed away suddenly, and he's 18 years old at the time. He's now, his mother is a widow, he's an 18-year-old without a father, and we're looking at the fragility of life and saying, God, he just walked out the door and never came home.
Wow.
And son, and that could happen to his mother, and going back to that fear of outliving a child and what they're going to do when you're no longer here. Yeah. We said the time is now. So that was 2010. By February 2011, we set up Spectrum Designs Foundation and the Nicholas Center in his name. And the idea was to create jobs and employment opportunities for people with autism and special needs throughout their lives. There's no effect on life expectancy, so giving them purpose, giving them a sense of inherent self-worth, structure, routine in a job. So we started with a t-shirt business because we knew the autism community was ordering t-shirts. And so we started with them as our guinea pigs, the classic American story in a backyard barn, set up a heat press, and we went from there. And it just grew and grew. And now we have 50 employees. About 30 of them are people with developmental disabilities, and we're printing thousands of shirts a day. It's an amazing thing.
How do you find those folks, and how is it for them experiencing this work life and having this prospect for gainful employment for the long term? To what extent are they looking at it as transformative within their own lives?
Yeah, it's amazing. Unfortunately, I have, New York State, there's a 67% unemployment rate for this population. So I have a huge waiting list, which is why we always want to grow and expand. But yeah, a job really can change everything. And for so many, it's not even about the paycheck. It's about being part of a team and feeling valued and having purpose, and it's a vocation. The amazing thing for me that I never thought about was the families and the parents in particular. There was one story on a weekend. We were very busy. It was a big order that we had to get done. And I called one of our families because their child is, I couldn't really ask him. I had to ask his parent guardian. And I said, look, can Greg come in? We're really busy and we need him on Saturday. And his mum stopped me and said, you have to understand, he's 24 years old. No one's ever told me they needed my son before. No one's ever expressed that to me. And I stopped and I paused and I took it in, and I thought, that's so sad. But at the same time, I was like, but can he come in? I do need him, like, what's going on, And so those are the ripple effects, the stone in the middle of the pond, that it just ripples out. And so it's truly transformative. And yeah, they never dreamed that this would happen. And that's what brings me there every day.
If you could tell one story about someone who you've seen had a life change because of their employment with you, I'd love to hear it.
So I think there's so many of them, but I think I would tell,
share too.
I would tell a story about Josh. He had previously worked in a kitchen on Long Island and various jobs and volunteer jobs, and had a really horrible experience in the kitchen, being made fun of, being bullied, with a group of people that just didn't understand. It wasn't an accepting environment for him. And we brought him on, 5 years ago now, I think, and he has just grown from strength to strength. Public speaking. He has his own podcast now called Sounds Like Autism, where he talks about being an individual with autism and what the world is like for him. He's done a TEDx talk. I mean, he was a shell of a person, and he's just come out of it. And for him, again, and he's got friends, and those things for me are so magic. But yeah, he's one that stands out just because of what he's done. And he comes into my office and he asks me, I want to keep going. I want to get higher. How do I get in your chair? And I'm just like, well, hang on a minute there. But he's got ambitions. I don't blame him.
I love it. I love it. If you had a dream one day for what the ultimate vision of Spectrum Designs could be, and what its impact in the world could look like, what would that be?
I think our vision is that people see only ability, and that people aren't underestimating, undervaluing, not seeing that there's potential in everyone. And so for me, we do that by putting out a great product, and that's kind of the relic to what the capabilities are. But I would love it to be much broader than that, and for people to truly look beyond disability or autism or a label and just say that's a person that can contribute and should be in our community, and has something to add. And it's not charity, it's a hand up, it's not a handout, you know. And these are things that I would just love. And I think it just takes time, and it takes patterns of thoughts to change. And you know, you think about the value of inclusion and adaptations. You know, we adapt the work environment to make it work, but you know, there's the story of you know, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, made sure that in New York City and in around the country that there was curb cuts so that, you know, the wheelchairs could get onto the curbs, right? But that helps. But that helps more than just people in wheelchairs. That helps people pushing strollers. That helps people moving, you know, trolleys and trucks. And so the idea of inclusion and tolerance for all, it's not just affecting the disabled community. It affects all of us and benefits all of us.
You know, one of the interesting things, though, that's embedded in that is something that I talk ad nauseum about, and that is the destructive impact of human commodification. In other words, people being viewed only insofar as there is a perception that they can contribute to the GDP or otherwise, you know, have some sort of economic impact at an optimal level. And what I'm hearing is that there's a connection between that and the concept of, or at least a connection between the resistance that I feel culturally needs to occur in order for us to move beyond a lot of the economic devastation and cultural polarization and general misery that COVID and other similar, you know, economic and social and political developments have brought onto our society. A lot of the solution is, in my opinion, for us to begin to rethink how we define value with regards to humanity. And as we talked a little bit about earlier in the show, and even before, you know, the podcast began, understanding the intrinsic worth of everyone is part of that. But one of the challenges that I would imagine that you'd find, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about, and in your case, I can relate to it because I worked for, frankly, a company, I co-owned a company that was a competitor of yours. It's that so many people are looking purely in the context of something that's highly commodified, like t-shirts, for the lowest price. And so where the product that's ultimately being sold is highly commodified, the production associated with that can be highly commodified, which drives down the price because the people producing it or involved in the production are seen as interchangeable to some degree. And one of the questions I have for you is, A, how do you resist that, being in a field where commodification is an unusually high level? B, where you have employees that by and large have been based on, you know, what you've said earlier, somewhat marginalized in terms of the value that they're seen contributing to our society because of this perceived limitation with regard to the ability to contribute to GDP. And then also what that means with regards to the decisions that people might be making about products such as t-shirts that they're making after they listen to this podcast.
Yeah, it's so interesting because this is being, you know, in this, I can't even say post-COVID world, but in this kind of, we're reflecting. I think we're having more of an opportunity to reflect on what the world could and what we can leave behind and what we can bring with us from pre and post-pandemic, or pre-pandemic at least. And I think there is a desire to shorten supply chains. You know, I think in the States and local to us could mean California, but, you know, it certainly isn't overseas. I also garnish some hope from articles and things you read about how, you know, corporations are being asked for more than their bottom line, and that they're being challenged and being expected to do good while doing good, you know. Yeah. And I think consumers are looking for that too, and that's probably what's moving that needle. So my hope of what we're seeing is if we can stay competitive, which is a challenge to your point, but if we can, then it becomes a kind of, well, why wouldn't we? And if there's a way, and if there's enough to go around, why wouldn't we support this group that are adding something beyond the commodity, right? And you know, I look at it often, and this is at such a divisive time. I think trying to find something bipartisan is a challenge. Yeah. And I think this is something that's bipartisan because you've got a business that, from an economic point of view, is diminishing taxpayers, right? Adding, you're taking people off taxpayers, or they're paying taxpayers, sorry, you're diminishing Social Security. You're you know, creating economic stimulus in the local area because they're buying, they're going to the movies, they're, you know, going to the deli, they're taking their paycheck and spending it back in, so it's cyclical. And then on the social side of things, you've got, you know, the social initiative, you've got the community, you've got people being included and integrated. So I think at such a divisive time, you can actually agree on that this is something that is beneficial to all from an economic and a social standpoint. As for where it's going, who knows? My hope is that, you know, these kinds of things accelerate trends. I think this kind of idea that corporations should be more responsible, not just for the community, but the planet, for diversity, inclusion, and beyond that, in education. I hope it continues in the right direction, and that, if anything, it accelerates.
Patrick, how do you feel when you hear or see the outcomes of the work that and the career paths that you're providing for some of your employees?
It's the best feeling. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning. You know, you meet a 30-something-year-old who's receiving their first paycheck, and they never even realized they could be paid for something because they've been asked to volunteer, or they've been put into things that just aren't what they wanted their whole lives. And I see that the best feeling I get is when I just take a stroll onto our shop floor and I see a group of people working, you know, with disabilities, varying levels, just operating a machine, and it's like it's nothing, and they're just running and they're working, and then and they're just producing, and it's amazing. The second best feeling, I think, is when I see them develop friendships outside of work, and see them hanging out after hours and still laughing and joking after they don't need to be there. Those are the two best feelings, because I know that I sometimes feel sick to my stomach when I think of what if they were born 50 years earlier, what it would have looked like for them. They probably would have been in an institution like Willowbrook in Staten Island, which one is the state's, I think it was the country's largest federal institution, only closed 40 years ago, or 40 years ago, 6,000 patients with 4,000 beds, you know, and we have to remember that, because if you don't, you're condemned to repeat it. And so, yeah, sometimes I feel sad when I think of that, but I'm thankful and grateful that these people are having that opportunity.
Well, and it is interesting that you mentioned Willowbrook, and I will go into a little bit more detail about that. I happen to be familiar with it. As you know, in a prior life, I worked for a company that ran group homes for adult individuals with developmental disabilities. And some of them actually were former Willowbrook patients. Wow. Willowbrook, for anyone who might be listening, was exactly the sort of institution that Patrick described. Geraldo Rivera, I think, did an expose about it in the 80s or the 90s. And it was so horrific that actually an entire season of American Horror Story was based on it. And it was like this whole nightmare thing. And it really was where people, the perceived lack of their ability to contribute, and their vulnerability put them in a place where they literally, it was hell on earth. And that's not an understatement.
Right. And they didn't matter, right? That was it. It was the understanding that it didn't matter, because who was going to advocate for them? And yeah, it's heartbreaking. It still is.
I mean, sometimes when I think about others' experiences, I try and imagine, what would the world be like if I woke up and saw it through their eyes? What would my world have been like if I woke up and I was in Willowbrook? this dark, dingy place where there was literally, shit on the walls and nurses that were abusive or didn't care and old clothes and all this sort of stuff. And if I knew that was going to be the rest of my life, one of the things, and I would love to hear your reflections on this as well, that still touched me about this company when it ran those group homes was that when Christmas came, a lot of the families of those individuals kind of would put them in these houses and then sort of forget that they existed. Now, that was not universal, but the people in those homes, the other residents, were the families of the residents that were there because their own families just put them.
Yeah. Right.
And so there was always purpose for the people that were working directly with them because they knew they were providing something that was so valuable. I mean, is that something you or any of your staff that are not part of the spectrum might have experienced, or does that trigger anything in you?
I agree. Yeah. I mean, that's what first hit me as a camp counselor. But one of my other favorite things is seeing a screen printer or someone who's worked at a million different warehouses come in and be hired by us, and because they seem to be accepting and tolerant and they're going to fit in, and then suddenly realize that they couldn't work anywhere else, and one of my screen printers said once, I could sit in a room with, a doctor and a financial person and a lawyer, and I feel like I have the coolest job in the room, and I'm a printer, and that to me, again, it's about finding that greater purpose, something that you see as bigger than yourself. And I talk to my staff all the time and I say to them, one of my biggest fears is always looking back, when I've retired or when I'm on, my career's over, and saying, well, how did I move the needle? What did I do to change the world for a better place? And I tell our staff all the time, by doing what they're doing, they're part of that. They are doing that, they are contributing that, and they can have no regrets, and they should sleep the sleep of the righteous, and that's really, I think what makes it so special.
Yeah, and it really is. Patrick, how can people find out more about Spectrum?
Our website, spectrumdesigns.org. We're active on social media. I'm active on LinkedIn and Google. Give us a call, send us an email. It's all there.
And why should they be reaching out to you? Like if they want to have some t-shirts print, do you all do other things? Do you all do embroidery, any of those other?
Yeah. Full range custom apparel, so t-shirts, embroidery, hats. We also do promotional products, pens, mugs. I think what's important is, we've told this wonderful story, but it's really important that it's also it's a social enterprise, but we underline the word enterprise. We're price competitive, quality driven. We have an art team. We never expect anyone to pay more. So I think that's really important. You can kind of get what you need and check a box of social impact and corporate good.
Yeah. And Patrick, how can people reach you or find out more about you personally?
LinkedIn's probably the best. I am on Instagram, but I think from a kind of reaching out, LinkedIn's probably the best bet. It's just my name, Patrick Bardsley.
Excellent. And is there anything else that you want us to know about that Spectrum might be having coming up, or that you have coming up?
Yeah, we're expanding into Westchester, so that's very exciting. We're on Long Island. We're adding a second location, hoping to create 20 new jobs in the next year. So that's a big deal for us. I would say that's the biggest thing. I just want to thank you, Scott. Again, I think this is such a valuable podcast, and there's a lot of different podcasts out there, but I feel like this is unique in that it's about combining purpose and finding purpose, and you really can find it anywhere. And I don't think you have to start a social enterprise or do anything, or have a transformative experience. It can be in charity work. It can be in all different areas. And so I just want to thank you for highlighting the different options.
My pleasure. And look, if there is anyone that I could be walking down the purpose highway with, I am glad that it is you. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on today. It has been a pleasure.
All mine. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. And I will talk to everyone and see you all again during our next episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Join our community today at purposehighway.com and subscribe to get notified when new episodes go live. Scott Mason, checking out.